My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by two ruggedly good-looking men. One a little more so than the other. I'll let you take your guess as to which I prefer.
It's me. Me.
Okay, Max, calm down.
Nice.
So it's Max, Aita, and Zach Caswell. Max, how you doing?
I'm doing well, ruggedly well.
Zach, how are you?
I too am ruggedly well.
Yeah, that's a great start to a podcast that I don't think anyone could have anticipated having us three on a call to discuss weightlifting and all things related. Before we dive into it, Zach, you were on the podcast previously. I think the title was The Bane of Weightlifting. So if people want to listen to that episode, they can go back and check it out. You haven't been on really any other podcasts. You really haven't gotten your face out there, pushed any Zach Caswell centric content. So let's give the listeners a bit of an intro, just so they have a sense of who you are, where you've been, what you're doing, before we roll into the conversation.
Cool. I'm just kind of starting this out because for a long time I've just kind of been a coach or a business owner that didn't want to be doing this type of stuff, mainly because I just like to produce and win and kind of like show out from that standpoint. But since we've grown and things like that, my staff has said like someone has to be the voice of this organization. So I've been kind of coming into things and doing more things like this and getting exposure and also kind of just talking about what's on my mind and things like that because it's important. But I own two different facilities, Optimus Barbell in Southfield, Michigan, and Optimus Sports Performance and Training Center in Livonia, Michigan. That's in a 90,000 square foot sport complex. Both are very unique business models in its own outright. We employ 10 coaches currently at the moment. We go inside of two different high schools to be the strength and conditioning coaches. And we control right now strength and conditioning for about 30 total sports. And what makes this a little different is we don't pull people into our gyms. We go and get background checked from EduStaff, kind of the national governing body for substitute teachers and things like that. We get immersed into the high school. We do like attendance tracking, specific programs for each sport, or whether it's like certain times of the year and things like that. I'm an instructor for USA Weightlifting as well, and been doing this for like 11, 12 years. That's kind of it.
Yeah. And I think a good question to kind of lead with, and the conversation, since we have both of you on, guys who have spent, collectively, including myself, I mean, we probably collectively have 40 to 50 years kind of in weightlifting and in strength sports. And I think we'd kind of be remiss to not discuss what that's been able to teach us, and from many different standpoints, right? I think we all have somewhat like connected but different skill sets in a similar space, but kind of exploring that differently. So, Zach, what was the main reason for pursuing weightlifting, sports performance as a profession?
Honestly, like I got into coaching, I guess, kind of by luck. So I was living in Florida in it's Lantana, which is 10, 15 minutes south of West Palm Beach. And I was kind of working out at this random CrossFit gym and, just like maxing out randomly because, why not? And this guy was like, hey, you're strong and you kind of look like you know what you're doing. Would you want to coach a weightlifting class here? And I was like, yeah, sure. That's fine. What's the kind of the worst that can happen? Like, I've been lifting for a while. Like we did some power snatching and jerk in high school and cleans in high school. And for college football, we did some jerk and we did a lot of cleaning, especially from the hip. It looked horrendous, but at least I had like the conceptual knowledge of what we wanted to do. And like CrossFit at the moment, like I was just interested in more of the weightlifting side of it. So this guy was like, hey, let's start this, this weightlifting class. And I think it was like a Thursday. And I thought like, I don't know, 2 or 3 people were going to show up, and 30 people showed up on day one.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, we need to figure this out because I don't know what I'm doing. So I did my L1 with Camargo down in Miami in Hialeah. And I kind of just like stuck to his hip for a while. I text him a ton. At meets, I would just like kind of stand behind him and watch him do his thing. And this is like 11 years ago. And then I just got really lucky being in West Palm Beach. Like my first 3 lifters, one went to Junior Worlds. The other one took like 4th or 5th at Youth Nationals at like her 2nd or 3rd meet. And the other one's been lifting in the top 10 like every year for like the last like 9 years. So like when I started, I thought like I was God's gift to earth of coaching because I had these studs. And when I moved back to Michigan and I had to coach someone brand new and I had like zero idea what to do, because I was used to getting people that were a little developed and just like kind of polishing up. And I thought that was coaching.
Right.
And when I was thrown into an environment of actually having to develop someone from very little or zero conceptual knowledge, I kind of just went into work mode, worked 7 days a week. It didn't matter. I would, if it's 5:30 in the morning till 8 p.m. at night, it is what it is. So I only thought of like, how do I develop myself or how I help learn is just volume. So I got to see it. I got to look at it. If I don't know something, I got to ask questions, and I just really got to like work as hard as possible. And that's kind of how things ended up happening. Before I moved back to Michigan, Optimist was like a 30-person club. I was like we were in 5 different gyms. I was still working my regular job for basically a physician recruitment group and physician contract group. So I was still doing that while working at 5 gyms, while still doing like my training. So like I would do like my squats and accessories, like my T-bar rows, my biceps, all that stuff, like at 5:30 in the morning. And then I would work, and then I would just slap together some snatch, some clean, or some jerk, and some pulls before I would go coach. So it'd be like a 5 to 5:30 a.m. kind of day, all the way to like 9 to 10 p.m. And that's kind of how it worked.
Yeah. And I think it's important because spanning that much time and that much, as you mentioned, that much volume, you see a lot of different problems. You encounter a lot of different solutions. You talked about kind of like shadowing Camargo and having that as a big point of contact to help develop kind of like a coaching approach to weightlifting. Who are your biggest influences, and who would you say can really be seen in the way you program, the way you coach, technique, the way you just coach more generally?
The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring weightlifting closer to the fans, athletes, and coaches of the sport. They're able to do that by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. And myself, I've been working with Weightlifting House for over 6 years, and I have nothing but gratitude and respect for Seb and the entire team. If you use code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, you can get 10% off your purchase through Weightlifting House. Order today, support Weightlifting House, and support the podcast.
Like this is probably going to sound like absolutely bad, but like it is what it is. I think a lot of the way that I coach today, or I even approach coaching today, is what I like to do is think about it of the people that were bad to me as coaches, and I want to do the opposite. Even when I was kind of up and coming and kind of just growing, like when I went from coaching like 20 or 30 people to coaching 70 people in a year. And kind of bouncing around and doing all these other things and writing programs for all these people. And I kind of looked at it from a perspective of like, okay, from a college football standpoint, I was treated a certain type of way. I don't want to treat people like that. From like a weightlifting standpoint, I just don't want to do I don't want to take Bud Charnaga's manual that I read, from the Russian weightlifting team and do what they're doing, because I don't think it makes sense. And I don't want to do just weightlifting. I would rather build balanced athletes that happen to weightlift. And for a long time, I wasn't called a weightlifting coach by a couple of my peers. I was just like an accessory coach or like a remote coach or like things like that. But I was still sending like 8 to 12 people to national championships like every year. And I looked at it from, well, I got to be doing something right, even if people just don't want to acknowledge it. So I think a lot of my coaching and even programming and even looking at it are influenced more about the coaches or the people that were bad to me or mistreated me or things like that, rather than the people that like Camargo, for example, being a great guy. Like, I never really sat down with him on programming design. I just watched him coach. And I was like, man, I like the way that he communicates with people. I like the way how he handles himself in the back room. I like how he engages with his athletes. I think that's cool. And from a weightlifting or program design standpoint, I just never wanted to be one-dimensional. Because it never made sense being a college athlete. Like, we want to have the most developed body possible so we can lower injury rate, so we can be explosive. Like, if we have to go run, we can go run. If we have to be dynamic, we can be dynamic. If we got snatch heavy, we can snatch heavy. If we got deadlift heavy, we can deadlift heavy. Like, I'm just want to be ready for it all. So that's kind of my general influence behind it and my thought process of, hey, X amount of people were bad to me over the years or treated me a certain way. I don't want to be that dude to anybody.
It's interesting, like the approach you take, because I feel like a lot of us that were, it kind of mirrors some of my like philosophies around coaching, which is like, I know what I did wrong and I know how hard I tried, and how like there's just better ways to go about doing it. And so like, yeah, it's definitely like a governing sort of motivation for me as well, which is to, to make sure that I'm actually training people in a way that is not just a replication of what I learned and sort of this like check out, like, yeah, it's fine. This is what I did. And if you don't get there, it's because of you, not because of the program or the coaching or anything. So yeah, that's like, it's very similar to how I sort of philosophically approach it.
Yeah, I think I'll even to this day, like on a probably like a weekly basis, like I'm all like, I love questions. Like when people, hey, why are we doing this? Let's answer it. And even if one of our coaches are like, hey, this doesn't make sense, like what you're doing from a textbook standpoint, I kind of like go back at them to where I'm like, even the people that we study from were looked at like crazy because they were doing things outside the box. And I would rather not be bound by a pillar of knowledge. I would rather say, hey, I want to try this because I'm seeing an athlete move a certain way. And coaching and programming is a very subjective approach and individualistic approach. And so like, hey, if I'm doing something that might not make sense to you right now, let me explain to you my thought process of where I'm at in behind this whole micro macro cycle and things like that. Let's try to push the boundaries of human performance rather than just saying, hey, this is a textbook and this is what it tells us to do. In history class, I learned some things that weren't really accurate. So I just kind of take that principle along all sorts of training. I'm sure there's some things that, yeah, might have made sense back in the 80s or 90s or even early 2000s. But as kids evolve, as athletes evolve, as life evolves. We just have to figure it out as a coach and as a coaching staff. And do we want to be leaders, or do we want to be people that are kind of just following the status quo?
Well, and I think a lot of what we attempt to do, I just kind of say that like Max, myself, and probably a lot of other coaches listening, is you need like a basic starting point. And I think that's ultimately what people are groping for. They're trying to figure out like, where do I start? So you'll hear questions of like how much volume, what intensities, which exercises, what's the structure. So you're looking at these basic like framework centric problems or questions. They're saying, okay, where do I start? Because I have no clue. And part of that is then you have to look at what are like general recommendations. And I think Max even mentioned on a podcast a handful of times, like Prilepin's chart or Prilepin's table, you know, conveniently renamed Max's table. Hopefully we can get that fully adopted by everyone. But you look at that and you're like, oh, here are general recommendations. I should do around 4 to 6 reps at this percentage with this much volume, and total volume can hit like this upper limit. Yeah, that's like that's an extreme generalization, and it's like founded on good sense making, right? Like it makes sense. It's probably in alignment with around what people can do or can benefit from, and that's a great starting point. But as soon as you have that starting point, it's just this constant iterative process of what worked and what didn't. Okay, how do you know it worked? Okay, if it did work, double down on it or just keep it the same. So then you ask these just like more and more narrow questions. There's a really interesting fact, and I'm listening to a book called Determined by Robert Sapolsky. And he was talking about our capillary system, like in the capillary system in the body spans around 48,000 square feet. And he's like, to be able to fit it into such a small space, you have to have a certain like operating principle of like, you have a vessel that's a certain diameter, and when it reaches a certain length, which is like 4x, 4 times the diameter, it bifurcates or it splits. And that process happens, but like the numbers change so that it splits and splits and splits, so that you basically have capillaries everywhere within a certain distance from each cell in the body, so you can supply nutrients and remove waste. That's the iterative process of coaching. It's like you have that basic framework, you have that like big vessel, and then you're like, how do I split? How do I change? And then you keep changing over time. And then you keep sussing out like new areas, what works, what didn't. You get more information coming in, more information going out, and you somehow triangulate all that. And it sounds like a very complicated, overwhelming process, but it's actually kind of to your point, Zach. It's what makes it not. It's what makes it fun because it's creative and it's not textbook. So when people reference like, why'd you put that exercise in that slot? Like that doesn't fit this textbook's recommendations. Like, give a fuck what that textbook says. Like, I mean, the textbook doesn't tell you how to coach. It gives you basic recommendations for maybe like general or specific adaptations within very, very constrained contexts. So like, to develop power, do this. And it's like, okay, I get that. But I'm working with someone who is, an individual in a very unique situation with certain amounts of training volume and certain needs. Piecing that all together, that's kind of the coaching puzzle, but it's not led necessarily just by everything you can read or listen to or, find in some citation.
Yeah. I mean, we were kind of talking earlier, and like I have a double major in international business and psychology, but I've been training since I've been, 9 or 10. And I was fortunate enough. Do you guys remember like Bigger, Faster, Stronger?
Yeah.
So like the dude that actually created that actually came to our high school and like started coaching us. So like we got this very, even at an early age of like 13, 14 to 18, like we had this very structured program in regard to training. And when I was a freshman in high school, I think it was like the coach just came in and like that was their first winning season in like 20 or 30 or 40 years or something. And from 99 all the way to last year, that high school was like a powerhouse, like just crushing it. But we lived in and outside the weight room. So when I got to college, like being in that mentality and doing that, like that was a no-brainer to me. That's where we made that's where we actually won football games and things like that. And that's how we connected. And when I got outside of it and I was working like my regular jobs and I was still training and doing things like that, and I always kind of wanted to do coaching or something sports related or something in the equivalent. But I would say, yes, I've done certifications, and yes, I've done, I don't know, 6 or 7 certifications or whatever it may be. But a lot of my learning has come from shadowing, interning, watching others do it, doing it myself. Like any program that I write that might be different than what we've done in the past, I do it first for at least 3 weeks to see what it does, right? Like if I'm coupling, like I made a mistake and coupled, like I was trying to do a bunch of Hatfield versions of like lunges and squats and things like that. And I was like, I'll couple Hatfield lunges on the beginning of the week and I'll do some Hatfield squats later in the week. And it just was a nightmare. And I'm like, well, this, I thought in my head, like, hey, I'm going to just blow through like all these squats. And then my traps were so fried that like I couldn't do anything else. So I'm like, well, I don't want to give this to anybody. So I'm going to modify it. I'm going to remove some of this out, and kind of go from there. So the biggest thing for me is I don't have the classical background of going to exercise phys or anything like that. What I have is just, I don't know, 26, 27 years of training experience, being with coaches from every certain level, whether it's like, I played soccer, basketball, baseball, football, lacrosse, rugby, wrestling. And so you have all these different stimuluses, all these different ways to train, all these different ways to prep mentally. And I use more of a psychological approach than like anything else, because when we get to competition, training is training, but being able to control yourself from a mental standpoint is the biggest hurdle.
It's interesting because like I think kind of going back to the Prilipin stuff, and like if you think about coaching at the level that most people do it, like coaching is, if you use the analogy of like construction, like building a house, coaching is largely like being maybe something like the foreman or the guy, kind of like in charge of, the job site, where like you understand, like a good coach understands how a house is built from the perspective of like how to put the nails in, where they go, how to frame, like what goes where. Maybe they don't understand the like philosophy of different types of architectural schools of thought, but they understand how to actually put a house together. They can control it and do it in the field. That's like the most like sort of low level base level of coaching, because you could get somebody and take someone and be like, okay, this guy's a coach, I'm going to teach him how to teach the lifts, how to correct errors, how to psych someone out for a meet and do all these things, but he doesn't understand like the high level science behind it. And you can be wildly successful with that. And I think there's very few coaches that actually just stop there. There's this next level, which is like, you could understand all those things, but then continue to further explore and experiment and learn and incorporate more of a formal education from the perspective of whether it's from reading or from research or from actually going to school or whatever, and start to build out that knowledge. So you're not just now the foreman, you're also like, you understand some of the architectural stuff and the engineering behind a house and these things. And so it gives you this sort of like, I think that the best coaches are people who are there. The way we used to say this was like, you need 3 things. You need at least 2 of 3 things, but preferably 3. And those things are, 1, you have to have experience. You have to have actually done it yourself or coach somebody else to be good. 2, you have to have some kind of formal education in it, in that you are you're educated to some degree. And then the third is that you have to, prove that you understand it, right? That you could explain it to somebody else. You could pass it on to someone else. And so kind of where I'm getting to is like what you're saying, where it's like you might have a huge, vast, like sort of scope of the experience and doing it and being there. And like, you're the foreman and you've done this, but you've also got this other like sort of formal education in that you've done and tried a ton of things and learned a ton about it, and so it's not just like to say like, oh, you have to like go to school and do sports science and you take that and now you're going to be a good coach. It's like, it would be like grabbing an architect out of the firm, like, all right, hey, like put that wall up,
Right.
Because he's not going to know the little things like, oh, if we we nail a 2x4 to the edge, we can prevent the wall from sliding when we lift it up. Or if I toe nail it this way, it does this other thing. Like the intricacies of actually doing it, you pick that stuff up. And so it's like this merging of those things where it's like you have a really high level understanding. A great coach has a high level of understanding of how stuff works from like a principle standpoint and like this overview, but then also can go down and actually build something and actually make an athlete good. And that's rare. That's like really rare to see. I think a lot of people get to that place of coaching where they kind of stop at the sort of foreman level where they figured it out, right? Like, I know how to go in the gym and yell at people and get them to be better at lifting. And we can go to meets and we can get meets done and do that. When we run into problems that we don't understand, we just kind of stop, or we flounder, or things fall apart, or they leave.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, like I had a friend of mine be like, I figured out how to teach the snatch.
Yeah.
And I was like, good, like, dope, dude, because I'm still learning. I'm like, at the end of the day, like, yeah, you figured out a great way for your people, and they're crushing it. You know what I mean? And that's fantastic because like you've unlocked another, like you got another infinity stone. Like, great. Like that's fantastic. But if you immerse yourself into a brand new gym where they don't know you and they don't know your style, they don't know your cues, they don't know what you're asking for, are you able to develop them to the same rate that you are in your gym where you're cozy, you're comfortable, people know you, they believe in you, they believe in your system, they'll bleed for you, they'll do all that stuff. And that's why I like immersing myself in other gyms as much as I can, because I want to see like, okay, can I do this with a random at any point in time? And that's kind of like my favorite piece of it of, okay, you have this toolbox, and whether it's the snatch or the squat or the clean or whatever, you have a toolbox of 1,000 different things. What do you want to use today? When we do seminars, I think sometimes it freaks people out, like especially if they're like shadowing me or things like that. They're like, all right, what's the seminar about today? And I go, well, we're doing snatch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get everyone around. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to introduce you. And I'm going to ask everybody what they conceive of their problems in the snatch. And I'm going to write it on the board. And it can be anything from everything. And then you're trying to piece apart on the fly, like what people are meaning, right? Like, you know, like they might say my problem is one thing. And then you're like, well, actually, that's like 3 steps back. And so I'm writing this program. I'm writing like all their issues on the board. And I say, all right, we're going to take 10, 15 minutes for you to warm up on your own in regard to your ankles or anything that you need that are specific to you. And then I'm going to put you underneath my warm up. And within that 10 to 15 minute period, I'm writing on the board what I want to cover for the snatch. And sometimes our staff is like, okay, we're in it. Let's go. And I'm like, yeah, to me, this is coaching. Because like I've gone to seminars where I have this like brilliant plan in my head, quote unquote, and it's trash for the people that are there. and I've had to evolve it. So all of our seminars, I've just kind of gone into it being like, okay, what do you think your problems are? Let's write on the board. Let's decipher it. Let's talk about if that's the terminology that weightlifters use, and let's fix it.
Well, I think what you both got at independently is and kind of to your point, Max, it pays to have a really high level overview, understanding, and like depth of understanding of everything that's going on. And obviously you can't know every single thing, but having kind of those three buckets filled of what you mentioned, which is like coaching someone, getting an education, and competing. Those are really important because that allows you to then, as Zach, as you mentioned, like on the fly say, I can recognize these patterns based on how people are talking or performing or, what their perceptions are, what their issues may be. And I can come up with a game plan. And the game plan is not just being pulled out of thin air and, you catch the bar forward. We're going to do some snatch balance today at the seminar. It's like, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, it could, but it doesn't. So you're trying to come with the most prepared toolbox to then, remediate any potential issue. And I think that's like, you have to be as prepared as possible. And that's by having a very, very thorough understanding, just having a lot of experience and time in the sport. And then the little piece I'm going to add, and I did a podcast with Leo Totten. So if you guys are listening to this, everyone who's listening, go check out the episode with Leo on coaching. It was a great episode. And I talked about like coaching self-awareness. This idea that as you're coaching, that also is an iterative process of said something, it didn't work, it actually made it worse, rewind. Okay, let's try different approaches, different cues, different styles. And it's not styles as in I'm going to be the authoritarian, right? I'm going to be the dictator, or I'm going to be the compassionate, like caring. It's just like, oh, you don't want to be yelled at right before you go out for an attempt, so I'm probably not going to do that. Or, these cues don't tend to resonate. You need a different type of cue or a different focus, or you don't need cues at all. You just want to try it out and see what you can do. Maybe you prefer just exercises that tend to help you feel the problem versus just kind of being yelled at the entire training session. So it's a sense of you're trying to have the best grasp on the sport that you can from the highest level to the lowest level. And that would be like from a practical level in the trenches to a theoretical level where you're kind of reading books and research and information, because those are all streams of evidence coming from people who have done it in different ways, in different dimensions, and then giving you information about like, well, this didn't work or this did work. And it's like not by chance. So it's important to keep note of. And then you apply that in, whatever setting, whatever gym, which is the challenge. And then, you have the awareness to then evolve kind of in the moment and then across moments. And I think, I think that's good coaching.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like 7 or 8 years ago, I went from a very traditional weightlifting program and I went to a juggernaut program. So that's what's up, Max. Like,
oh man, I'm sorry.
I know, but like we were doing so much back work and I'm like, I am not doing enough back work in my original program. And I'm like, okay, well, if I'm just like snatching and clean and jerking myself to death, like I'm kind of like missing the boat here. And so I looked at some of these other programs and things like that. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to do it because like I'm coaching. And I think I was coaching like 30 or 40 people at the time. And I'm like, this is way too much. I can't do this. And like kind of losing it. But I started like doing all these different programs and seeing how other people thought about it. And conceptualize different things and things like that. And I'm like, all right, so we can evolve and we can continue to do this. And it's taking like actually being in it and taking people's thought processes and crediting them for that. So like, I'm kind of crediting you in this like situation, Max, of being like, okay, you got me to think about my mid back differently and how I program it and how I talk about it and how I even lift and things like that. And a coach of mine, he competed in a 109 plus session at AO finals. And our biggest, like we were watching some people like walk around and our biggest takeaway is like, we're not doing enough back work as a club. Like I'm watching people walk around and I'm like, I see my people and our people and I'm like, I think we're missing the boat on some of these things. of what we need to like conceptualize and go back at. So I think another thing of coaching is like, I don't really necessarily think I have a style or anything like that. I try to take whatever fits, like whatever's fitting this quarter. Like, what do we need to do to be better throughout this year, and actually planning for the year? Like, we're doing a team meeting in 10 days with our, so we'll stream it and everything like that. And we're talking about, hey, what's our plan for the year? What do we want to do from a national level, from an international level to a local level? Here's inside of my head in regard to the conceptual framework of what I want to do in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. What should we be doing? What's our mentality, or what can we do to approach that? How can we be better as a team? How can we be better organized? And just kind of like putting everyone on the same page. And it's something that we're doing that's a little bit new to our group, of doing like a whole group meeting rather than just like individual meetings, because I think it's going to be a little bit easier overall. But I'm excited to see what happens going into 2024 if like the entire team rallies behind what's our macro, what's our micro, and what's our individualistic goals.
Right.
So we can look at it from the team aspect, the community aspect, the individual aspect, and how can we attack it as optimists rather than just, a bunch of individuals kind of rallying together.
That's cool. Do you find that in your observation, like of the current landscape of coaching and planning and I guess like everything, right? From teams to coaching, like we were all at the American Open finals. What is your sort of feeling that there's a gap, or where is the gap as far as like what most coaches, or what you've seen most commonly, from teams and coaches and stuff? Is it like planning or psychological, or, they don't have enough, good looking coaches on the team like Team Aita does with Josh and myself?
Right. Yeah. Like having help is important, like having help that like knows how to count and all that stuff, like important, knows how to talk to a lifter or the specific lifter in question is important. What I've saw a lot of is like, hey, there might be a head coach and a couple coaches, but like lifters are running lifters, which I get. If your club is like sending 40 people or whatever, like you got to do what you got to do. You know what I mean? Like I understand that. The biggest thing that I noticed at AO finals was coaches aren't actually like reading the room. They're just like, whether they're like, I've never wrote down attempts ever. Even when I went to Worlds in Mexico and like talking with the team lead and the head coach, I'm like, here's my build out to 75. And if 75 looks this way, so we had a 64 A session. And I'm like, here's the build out to 75 kilos in the snatch. And here's 7 different approaches to 91. And I make my jumps past 75 based around how our warm-ups are looking, how she's looking, the whole thing. And I do that with everybody. Like I call it the A, B, C, D, and E plan. And if we're on E, we are fighting for our life at that point. And I always have people with me that are going to load the bar. I'm going to be near the table, and I'm going to be looking at the room. I'm looking at everyone's start number, or like their actual number on their hip and everything like that. And I'm okay. They're at 65 and they're listed at 65. Well, I don't think that's going to work. So I need to adjust my count. So I'm watching coaches that aren't speeding people up properly, or aren't slowing them down, or aren't warming them up, or aren't taking the necessary jumps to keep their lifter in the best situation possible. With all of our people, I do not want them to get comfortable with a certain number in training. So each Friday or each Saturday or whatever we're doing, like comp days or things like that, we're taking a different approach every single time. So if it's billed out by 2s after a certain one, or it's billed out by 3, or sometimes 4 or 1, or whatever it may be. Like, I don't want you to be in a position where you're getting, okay, this is my opener and this is my opener only. No, we're pretty good in between, I don't know, let's say 88 and 91. Be ready for any of those. And I need to watch the room as much as I'm watching my lifter, because there's certain coaches that come up to me and say, hey, I'm gonna move, dude, just so you know. Like, no different than I think I did to you, Josh. Like,
That's
hey, are
right.
you taking this or what? Because, like, we are, and you were like, no, we're going to plan on going up. And I was like, all right, cool, man. Sweet. But, like, I don't expect that from everybody. And, it's a competition, and I get it. Like, I'm not living in this delusional world that, like, we all don't want to win. Like,
Right.
I get that. We all want to get the W. So it's on me as the coach to read the room at a astronomical rate, because I want to be in control of what I can control at all times. And if I can have a feel of every single platform while controlling our platform, then I did my job. Then the rest of it's just, line up, hit your opener, and let's square up from there.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of it's just like that awareness of what the lifter is capable of, what the room, like you say the room, but like the coaches and athletes in the session are capable of, and then being adaptable and saying we can build that adaptability into our training too. So then we're better prepared, instead of, this is kind of funny. This happened to Matt. We were coaching Matt in the 89B session, and he was warming up his snatches, snatch 120, snatch 124, looked great, had a long weight, and I was like, okay, go take a power snatch in the back. Goes in the back, misses it. He's like, I don't do power snatches in my training. And they're like, that's right. So it was just like a bad decision, because the training didn't prepare him for a situation in which that could be a beneficial like thing to do. Obviously, like, okay, we'll do a full snatch and then add a few kilos. But this sense of the training prepares the person for the competition, and then just having a sense of like, how many avenues can that go down? Like, what are the potential outcomes that could happen if you look great, you look really, really bad, somewhere in between. And that's then like coupled with if everyone looks great, if everyone looks bad, or somewhere in between, because we've all been in those sessions where there's a lot of red on the board. And then you've been in sessions where there's a lot of green, and like people are making every single lift. So you kind of have a sense of like, okay, in all these different situations, how do I react? And that's the idea, is like you have a proactive plan in place, but then you have a reactive sense of when this happens, what do we do? How do we pivot? And if we can be adaptable and be flexible and like not so rigid in how we feel it needs to be, that's probably going to make for the best competitive performance, across the board.
Yeah, like, and statistically, like, AO finals is a bloodbath.
Right.
Like, I'm not like, it's just end of the year. It's after Thanksgiving. Like, I get it. Like, it's statistically not a stellar meet for a bunch of lifters, right? Like, I was in sessions like all weekend long of just like red, and I'm like, this is what it is, dude. Like, I would love for it would be straight if everyone made everything, everybody love everybody, everyone, like, that's cool, but that's just not the sport, man. So
Right.
Like, if you're going to be a weightlifter, prep yourself for uncomfortable scenarios that include meaning that you're going to have to wait more than your desired 2 minutes to 2.5 minute rest period. You're going to have to be okay with people walking in front of your face.
Right.
You're going to have to be with some coaches not knowing etiquette. You're going to have to be around people that you think that they're better than you, and that's fine. Like, I don't care if everyone thinks they're better than me. I do not care about that. All I care about is, are we doing our job? Are we setting up our lifters for the best set of success? Are we doing things that not only are going to be crucial for the meet, but are also going to set them into a training plan coming off of this meet? Are we going to get more data? That type of stuff. So weightlifting is not an easy thing to plan for, depending on the meet. Like local meets, yeah, I can kind of control everything, even if it's not my meet, right? So, but if I'm going to AO finals or anything like that, like we're going to deal with people that are swinging for the fences, and there might
Right.
be 9 misses in a row.
Yeah.
It is what it is. Figure it out.
Max, what do you think? Kind of the question you posed to Zach, like what'd you pick up over the few days during the week and the weekend of how the athletes performed, how the coaches performed, and kind of a general sense of like where coaching is at in USA weightlifting.
Well, I'm glad you asked, Zach. Zach, sorry, Josh. I'm glad you asked. Let me start off with point number 1 of 7. No, I would say like the overall thing I notice is a lack of like, I think there's a general sense within the lifting world to sort of state that you're doing something because it seems like it's the right thing to do. Like, how many people that are coaches are actually tracking any of the data, like are tracking their lifters' training logs and reviewing them and looking and like, refinement. And like, I don't think there's really much of anything going on in reality, in the sense that like people are refining their process. And this is by and large, obviously there are people that are, but what I think I see most of the time is a lot of people that have some answers but miss a lot of answers. Like they don't have good, clear, like instruction or not instruction, a good, clear, like systematic approach to making themselves better coaches and improving their athletes. I think it's a tried and true kind of method. Like, we do this kind of training and then we do this kind of training, and they might make really pretty elaborate plans and do that kind of stuff. Or people will even be, a little bit less than that and like talk about the stuff they do, even though they don't do it. Like, oh, we track everything. And, we do this and that, and we're monitoring this, and we're doing yada, yada, yada. Right. But there just seems to be a sort of like a bit of a lack of refinement in people's processes. And it's probably because there's just not a lot of systems in place for a lot of people. So it's like, a good example would be like, like attempt selection, right? There's a lot of fucking misses at these meets, like a tremendous number of misses. And I had athletes, I had to lift or bomb out. I had, athletes, not do well. But it's one of those questions of like, what is the desired outcome for an AO finals?
Right.
Is it the meet you send it and you're just like, fuck it, we're going for broke, which I don't even know what that means. Like, we're just going to miss. Or is it that like you're taking lifts you can make? So like, that's an example where it's like, if people were truly refining their processes and doing this, shouldn't we see an increase in the number of made lifts at meets, right? Like overall, but it doesn't seem like that's really changed much. And then there's a lot of stuff. There's just like this sort of lack of systematic approach to things where, you see people making mistakes that seem like they would be pretty obvious to not make. And I can't think of any one particular thing, but just many little things that's kind of, apparent, right? How they're warming people up, or how someone is, taking an attempt at a weight they just have no business taking, or making pretty common errors regularly in the lifts. So that's like sort of the big thing, is it doesn't feel like there's a great approach to that. I think the other thing is that weightlifting has shifted a little bit just culturally to where social media dominates a lot of people's intent. So there's a lot of a lot of internet coaches or people that are trying to become, it's kind of about the club or about the image, or it's about something else, but it's not about like the lifting. And so that probably governs a lot of stuff, right? People participating in it for different reasons. And so it's like, it's just different. but I would say that overall, the biggest thing I notice is it doesn't feel like there's a pretty like systematic approach coming from coaches as to how to improve, how to change, how to iterate on what they're doing. It feels like a lot of people are just kind of, we do this program, and then when that works, then we do the next program, and then we do this other thing, but there's no like, good understanding of like tailoring something to an individual's response or any number of different aspects of it.
So this is an interesting thought experiment, and then Zach, I'll let you jump in after. But
no worries.
If you have a system that individualizes training, the thought would be that, and I actually picked this up from a podcast. I think Josh Pellin said this, maybe it was Josh, but he was saying that if you have a system that individualizes training, it should end up looking 1,000 different ways based on who the person is, right? Who the athlete is, because it's going to iterate to what they need. In theory, you can get from a completely like American Western periodization block model where it's like 10s, 5s, 3s, 2s, peak, to West Side if you have a system that actually does iterate to what the individual needs, because you're just making changes over time of like, this didn't really work, make this modification. This didn't really work, make this modification. I don't think anyone's starting out like a block model that's, very classic, but you're starting with something and then you're moving toward, what makes sense. So maybe a high day, like a high intensity, low volume day, and then a lighter, higher volume day within the week makes sense, a la kind of West Side-esque. And you can get to that eventually if what you're doing is adaptable. Now, it's not saying that it's likely to happen or it's going to happen, but the sentiment holds of you have a process of individualization, and by coaching someone, you get to this really different point where it's like, yeah, they are doing, 7 sets of 4 in the snatch, or 6 sets of 4, or 8 sets of 3 or something like that. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, well, they're getting continually better, so it's not making them worse. Maybe we adjust this thing later, but something's right? So you iterate to a point where you're making good results, and then you're just making smaller modifications after. So Max, kind of to your point, it's like have a system in place to get someone to a result. And then it's like, can you have the flexibility in your programming or approach to make it into whatever it needs to be without some, bias that it has to look like a block model, or it has to look like a daily undulating thing, or it has to fit a recipe. It's just like it ends up becoming something like that because it tends to make sense.
Yeah, I'm like seeing two sides of like the data tracking, right? Like when we went to Worlds, I had everything locked, stocked, ready to go. Like we were 9 for 10 at this, we were 10 for 10 at this, we were 0 for 3 at this. Mm-hmm. And it's like truly being objective, right? And I think that was refreshing for some of the people that were leading the team and things like that, because I want to go to this meet hitting what I want to hit. Like I want to do what I want to do for our lifters standpoint. And I understand that I need to have all this data lined up, ready for you, ready to go, not only for our lifters' confidence, but for my confidence, for my plans and things like that. And then on the other side of it, I see like people posting reels or whatever, and they're like, you should hit your openers more than once. I'm like, dude, no shit. Like that's not revolutionary topic to me, like it's, to me, it's like running a college football play. Like we would practice the same play thousands of times before we decided to commit to it, because everyone's got to figure out their own BS around it and their own mistakes and things like that. And you have to put yourself in pressure scenarios constantly to be able to deliver on what you're trying to do. And so for me, I'm like, hey, listen, if you're 8 for 10, as a lifter, if you come to me saying, I want to open up at X next meet, all right, cool. I'm gonna let you know what you need out of that. You need to be 8 for 10 in the singles at that. Mm-hmm. If you are, I feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. If you miss it, you know how to adjust. I know that if you miss it twice, you're gonna, you should be able to figure it out. Right. And we were put in that scenario. Like we had a girl that was like lights out at her opener. think 8 or 9 for 10. And we missed it twice. And then she went out and stroked it on the third one. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm glad we stuck to our guns here and we made it work. If you don't have like the necessary data in front of your face to be able to have confidence as a coach, I don't really expect the lifter to have confidence either.
Right.
Yeah. This is something interesting to me is like, I'm probably the worst offender of this, of like criticizing other people's strategies, usually in private, but and it's usually Josh's, talking shit about Josh's strategy when he's not around. But like, there's no right answer, right? There's just, I think Josh told me this the other day, Mike Israel was like, there's no right answer, there's just trade-offs. And so like, we exist in this world of like, someone would say something like, oh, we do our openers once before our competition. And then other people might be like, oh, we do our fucking third attempts 2 days out from the competition, no matter how many times we have to miss them to get them. And like, it's not to say any one strategy is wrong. It's just sort of trade-offs, right? Like, well, yeah, that's great. You did it one time and that was a month out. Like, maybe you want to be a little bit more in touch with what you can do at the meet. Or the other way is like, oh yeah, I mean, like, that's cool. Like, you're not going to be afraid of the numbers because you just made them, but you're probably going to be a little tired. So it's like this sort of thing of like, we don't even have a definitive way to say like, this is, objectively the wrong way to train for this. We can say it's less effective or it's not as good, but like, I mean, Pat Mendez, great example. Like, it's like he did at Worlds, like the story was at Worlds in 2014, he was in the back room and he had missing like 180 snatches like 7 or 8 times before he went out and bombed on the stage. And it's like, I don't know what the strategy was there or the general like approach to that, but like, that just was not good, right? Was it objectively wrong? Like, I guess after the fact you could say yes, but like, had he made a lift, is it now suddenly right? Well, no, it's always a trade-off. And that's something where, yeah, it's like this definite sense of like, people did sort of come to conclusions and start to like solidify that the conclusion they've made is now right. And so they just put these little things into this bucket of being right or being wrong. And so eventually, like, you're never rechecking your own hypothesis. You're never rechecking, or a lot of people are not rechecking to see if, like, what are the trade-offs of this worth it? It's just kind of like, oh yeah, we do it. We do our openers on Monday, and then we compete on Friday or Saturday or Sunday or whatever. That's the system. But there's not like a exploratory, like, what are the trade-offs of doing that? What should I do? What makes more sense? Or what kind of trade-offs would I get if I changed that approach and did my third attempts the day before, So it's like, that to me is sort of the thing that you notice with this stuff, is that like, it's just like stuff gets kind of hard coded, if that's the right term.
Yeah. I think like, I think another thing from a coaching standpoint, like, I'll use, for example, this girl that I've been coaching, I don't know, last 7-8 months or so. Her name is Sophie Shaft. She's a once in a lifetime athlete that I'll see, just from a mentality standpoint and things like that. Like, athletic, freak of nature, strong, got it all. She's got a very bright future ahead. And when people came up to me and they're like, "You're doing a great job," I'm like, "Dude, I'm doing nothing except for managing."
Right.
Like, this is a stud athlete. This is a athlete. And I think a lot of coaches can get into their delusions of grandeur. And even myself, when I was younger into it, like, I thought I was God's gift to earth, man. Like, I'm the shit, like, it's easy to be jaded in terms of when you have studs around you. And like, I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of studs around me at both of our gyms, but there's a certain degree, like, I'm a guide here. Like, yeah, I'm fixing some technique here and there, but I am very much a guide on this process. And I really can't take credit for like this athlete's success because yes, I'm doing things from a programming standpoint, putting you in positions to win, whatever. But there is a certain degree of like there's just natural general athleticism, and that's okay. You know, like it's cool to have dope athletes with you. Not a huge fan of like people being like, well, my program design is the absolute god, right? I'm like, well, if you didn't have that stud on you, would it still be cool?
Right.
You know, like it's just a kind of about taking a step back as a coach and kind of understanding what your role is. And like to your credit, Max, with like the internet and things like that, like everyone has a voice now, including coaches. And you can tell everyone why you're the best and why your program design is X, Y, and Z. But if it doesn't work outside of the realm of your certain stud athletes, you're going to have to redefine the model a little bit, and you're going to have to take a step back in terms of being real with yourself in regard to where you are in the learning process.
Yeah, I think there's also a thing, and Josh and I have spoke about this, you know, privately, but like there's definitely a vibe with everything that becomes commercial in which it becomes about something outside of the immediate goal, right? If the immediate goal is to snatch and clean and jerk more than your competitors and to, you know, defeat other people using someone else's body as a coach, you know, it's somewhere along the line you see people that they turn it into something that's all about them, right? And it's like you're referencing your greatness as a coach, or you talk about yourself as a coach, or you're, you know, it's like you put the forefront and the perspective, like you put into perspective yourself as a coach as the thing that's you know, that's something to be like, you know, I guess lauded after is like, oh, look how great I am. Look how great this team that I've built. Look how great it is. It's all about me and the culture I've created. And it's like, yeah, it's very subversive. This is not like overt, but you see this a lot. And it just becomes this thing where the culture kind of becomes about that. And then it's like, why refine your process if your process is just recruitment? Just get better athletes or get a bigger, you know, person, a better person, and then strap your name to them and then do the next thing, right? And you could even argue that I've done that, right? You could argue anyone has done it. But it's definitely like a thing that you notice now somewhat more common or somewhat more obvious than it was before, where it's almost like the aesthetic of what you really try to curate for other people to see is kind of like some of these people's main focus. That might sound really negative, but
I don't think it sounds negative because I kind of thought the same process of like, okay, yeah, my culture that we've defined or that we've worked at works at this weightlifting gym, but does our mentality work at a high school where no one knows me? And there were ups and downs to that because, you know, you go into a high school, you go from like you're at your main gym and, you know, people are very motivated or things like that. And you go to a high school where kids have, you know, taken 3 tests that day or whatever. And, you know, they don't really care about being there for that day. And how do you get them to be motivated and how do you get them to progress and how do you get them to move forward? And does your culture assimilate into 9 different avenues? And that's really what I wanted to do 5-6 years ago with this high school stuff is, okay, I know I'm decent at this weightlifting thing, but does our culture fit into sports performance or getting people to be better football players or basketball players or soccer players or volleyball players? Does our mental approach work at it? Does our physical approach work at it? And we've been fortunate that each year or each semester, rather, we evolve how we look at these athletes from a young level because, like, I'll be real, like what kids are motivated by now is very different than what I was motivated back like 99 to 2003 when I'm in high school and even in college. Like, we didn't have the transfer portal in college, and I couldn't make money like via my name in college. Now it's completely different. So like, we have to coach, and we have to understand that the landscape is moving so fast that if you don't keep yourself like where your feet are, you're going to lose yourself in the process. You're going to lose like friends. You're going to lose mentors. You're going to lose your club. You're going to lose your buy-in. And then you're going to be left with this like shell of what you thought you were, and not developing you as an actual human.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to kind of round this podcast out. Always trying to end it on a bit of a high note. And with that being said, I mean, I'm sure people listening are curious to know if they want to, you know, see more from you, Zach, and hear more from you, or at least from the gyms you run and the people you coach. Where can they go to find that?
So obviously we have our Instagram channels at optimus.barbell and optimus.performance. I'll give a shout out to two coaches that kind of really helped me out over the last like year, Aaron Scott and Crystal Rubel. Crystal has helped me transform my Instagram presence, I guess, because for the last year, like, I haven't really, like, she would be like, hey, you've gone 2 weeks without posting. You have to do something. And I'm like, well, you just take it over. And she's kind of transformed that stuff. And we're doing some informational pieces and things like that. We have those two channels and those avenues. We're currently working on a YouTube channel that's going to link to our app that we have. So I'll kind of roll that out and things like that. And we're very accessible via social media. So if you ever need anything, just hit us up and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Max, if people want to hire you as a coach, where can they go to do so?
Yeah, you can find me teamaita.com. You can find me on Instagram, max_Aita. Or if you're interested, you can obviously check out my other website, weightlifting.ai. If you want to try the AI program, and yeah.
I think the tagline for your OnlyFans and the weightlifting AI is built by the algorithm. I don't know what it means for the former, but I've heard that it transcends the app. If people are interested in checking out my content, you can follow me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PhilWL. It's philosophical weightlifting everywhere else. Teamaita.com if you want to get some coaching from some of the best coaches in the U.S. And we'll catch you all next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.